is the belief that only physical things exist. Other than the physical world, there is nothing else. I hope materialism is false. I want more to reality. I want more than physical things in the physical world, meaning beyond the mundane, a richer reality, possible purpose in life, something beyond death. That's why I focus on consciousness. Is anything beyond the physical? If yes, consciousness is a key to undermine materialism. If no, consciousness is a key to confirm materialism. Because for the philosophy of materialism to hold, physical facts must explain everything. And the big challenge is consciousness. Consciousness is inner awareness, felt experience, what it feels like inside to sense and to think. The big question is whether materialism can explain our inner awareness and felt experience. Or does consciousness defeat materialism? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. Sure, explaining consciousness is a central scientific question, but it's far more. It's the heavyweight championship of competing worldviews. In one corner stands materialism, in the other, consciousness. And the battle has only two possible outcomes. Either physical facts about the brain totally account for all aspects of the mind, and thus materialism subsumes consciousness, conquers it, or materialism cannot explain consciousness, and materialism is dealt a mortal blow. It's a game of great stakes, truly the meaning of life, the essence of existence, and winner take all. I want consciousness to defeat materialism. That's why I must be exceptionally careful. I cannot allow my hope to warp my reason. So, how might consciousness defeat materialism? How to frame the question rationally, neutrally? I begin with a leading philosopher of mind, Ned Block. Ned, some philosophers would use consciousness as the primary evidence to defeat the philosophy of materialism. Do you agree with that?
I think that if materialism is going to be defeated, it's going to come from consciousness. Consciousness is the one phenomenon in our lives that may not be understandable within a materialistic framework.
First, define materialism.
Okay, well, one version of it is the mind-body identity theory. It's that consciousness just is a state of the brain, the way water is H2O, the way lightning is electric discharges, the way heat is molecular kinetic energy. Now that could be defeated in two ways. One is, if it turns out that consciousness is a state of the immaterial soul, that would be really a big defeat for materialism. But another way would be if consciousness turns out to be something functional, whose essence isn't any particular kind of matter, but whose essence is something computational, the way adding is a computational thing. Now, nobody feels that the fact that adding does not have a material essence shows that materialism is wrong. But in the case of consciousness, I think it would require a different way of thinking if it turned out that a computer program could really capture all there is to consciousness.
Okay, but that would not invalidate materialism because the computer, whatever substrate that this is working on, is still well in the material world.
In the material world, but not essentially so.
How do you distinguish between that?
The idea is that water is essentially in the material world because it's just H2O. But adding isn't essentially in the material world because there might be an immaterial computer that could add. All it takes is to function a certain way. Even if an immaterial state could function that way, then it would be adding.
How would you rigorously define materialism or physicalism? Do these differ from each other? How do philosophers deal with that today?
The natural way to define physical is to define it in terms of what physicists talk about. But that leaves one hostage to the physicists of the future. We know that the physicists now are certainly wrong. Future physics will correct what physicists say now. So there is that problem in how to define physical. One way that people have of getting around that is to just do it in terms of non-mental. So the idea is that what's physical is what does not require mentalistic concepts to talk about.
Concepts. And defining it that way carefully, you can still ask the question about, is consciousness that kind of material? You haven't destroyed your definition by defining it that way?
Yes, because what you're saying is what consciousness fully is, something that can be picked out without using mentalistic terms.
Yes, and many people would answer no.
Yes.
You can't do that.
Right, many people would.
How would you conclude it? I mean, you skew very heavily to you think yes.
Yes.
But are you like 51-49 or 99-1?
I'm 90-10.
90-10, okay. But how has your feelings progressed over this? Over
I
your
used
career?
to be 50-50,
Really?
and now I'm 90-10.
Wow.
Because the science, the neuroscience of mind have been fantastic. We seem to be finding out more and more. It's looking more and more like consciousness is a biological phenomenon. Of course, things could go the other way, and that could defeat materialism if we hit a wall. But I don't think it's going to work that way. I'm a materialist.
Ned is a materialist, motivated by accumulating achievements of neuroscience. Personally, I bear witness. I did my doctorate in brain research, and I follow the remarkable discoveries. But I have doubts. Is neuroscience progressing in explaining the phenomenal experience of consciousness, or only in providing mechanistic components of mental content? But are my doubts caused by my hopes, or worse, by my superstitions? I should examine the other side, reverse my thinking for a while. What would it take to show that consciousness cannot defeat materialism? One way for me would be if consciousness could be created artificially in non-biological materials. I ask a robotics pioneer and entrepreneur, a former director of MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, Rodney Brooks.
I don't think that consciousness can defeat materialism. I think that consciousness and the things that we are emerge from the biological activity of the biomolecules. But that emergence may be quite complex. So I think modern physics says that chemistry emerges from physics. Mm-hmm. There are fundamental particles, they interact in certain ways, and out of that comes chemistry. But you wouldn't try to have a chemistry department which was just made up of physicists who didn't have the specialized chemical knowledge.
Sure.
We need a different set of tools to describe the chemistry. And I think that same is true in the biological systems and with consciousness. I think that it comes from what is below, but we aren't able to bridge that gap in any way right now. So it is worth asking the questions at that higher level.
The question is, when you get to consciousness, in principle, can you make that same statement? Can you say that for consciousness, if we knew everything at the lower level, we could, in principle, predict and explain consciousness?
I think that's an in principle valid thing to say. It's so far in the future, it's hard to...
And that's fine. The other argument would say that in principle, it will be impossible ever to be able to make that leap. But that's not saying there's some spirit or soul or anything like that. It just says that to go to consciousness requires something so different in the structure of the physical world that it's in principle impossible to predict.
I reject that. And I like to think about that level of complexity change with an analogy. If you look at what a computer is doing down at the lower level with bits going in and out, we can't infer the structure of the programming language. Right. But we know what it's doing. It was written in C++. When we just probe and look at those things, we even though we built the thing, it's really hard to reverse engineer it. So that in principle argument about consciousness coming out of the physical layer, it may be something we never do because it would take longer than the universe exists to work through all the computations.
But the question is, in principle, is it possible? Because many people now say that it's not possible, that there are kinds of laws operating at the level of consciousness which are sufficiently different. Now, they may be the equivalent of, to take an extreme case, a fifth law of force of nature.
I can't rule that out. That may be the case. We've come across new forces before in history. But since consciousness is so abundant around us, if it relies on this other law, I think we would have started to see other manifestations of it.
Do we have any help from the rapid development of artificial intelligence?
Well, I think the sheer bulk of computation doing some task makes us understand things differently. Mm-hmm. And I think we saw that with the Watson program from IBM that played Jeopardy. Right. Some of those answers that it came up with were completely amazing. How did it know to make that analogy, that wordplay? Well, it didn't really know. It was applying statistical techniques and doing a big search. Mm-hmm. But to us, it was really astonishing how it got some of those answers.
So at a certain level of deep quantitative improvement, you suddenly have a sense of qualitative difference.
Yes. To me, that says we see that we see another version of that emergence in these artificial intelligence systems. And it feels to us the same as seeing it in a human. And we know it's different. So that says to me, we don't need more stuff than mechanism to explain it.
So to external observers, it appears as if artificial intelligence is doing human-level things, even though we know that internally it is not. Well, isn't consciousness even more special? Consciousness is an internal experience that feels like something. That's radically special. It's not what consciousness does that's the problem. It's what consciousness is. I should explore the opposite side, where consciousness is assumed to transcend the physical. It's not hard to remain skeptical. I meet an expert in consciousness studies, President Emeritus of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Marilyn Schlitz. Marilyn, some would say that consciousness defeats materialism. Others would say that consciousness is the perfect expression of materialism. So consciousness becomes the battlefield for the fight over the worldview of the primacy and the dominance of materialism.
Well, I'd start by resisting the metaphor of a military battle.
Oh, I love it. I love battle.
Well, this is going to be a gender issue between us then. But I would prefer to think that they're complementary, and that certainly there is a biological material substrate that is consciousness and is very real. And it is equally true that people have these experiences that transcend this sense of our embodiment. I am increasingly fascinated by the discoveries we're making about the brain and the physical aspects of our consciousness. Things like intention that, had kind of been woolly and ill-defined. We now know about these sort of configuration of neurons called the mirror neuron. And we can see that the brain lights up in a certain way when we attribute intention to another person. Whether that's the complete final story is, to me, something that ultimately we're all going to have to die to understand. But if you accept the lineage lines of these various traditions, whether they're religious or spiritual or even, pagan, which one's going to win could become a political issue. One truth claim overriding another because they control the budgets of the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, and therefore they then become the official authorities on what is true.
We would all want to reject that, for sure. And even if that dominates, it can't last, because whatever is true, and if that is true, it will last.
But that assumes truth is an absolute reified construct. And what I would argue from the history of science is that our model of what is true has changed periodically over time, and it's going to continue to change. And my hope is that rather than seeing these kind of militaristic metaphors as the dominant paradigm, is to begin to cultivate a position of pluralism.
Here's the reason I use the militaristic language, because that's what materialism has set up. Materialism doesn't say, we explain some of the things and we can have other things, because if there is anything that materialism can't explain, then materialism by its self-definition is destroyed.
Well, my hope is that as we move into 21st century life with all of the ways in which complexity and multiplicity of viewpoints come together, that we can begin to build a more humble approach to this question about what is true. And I think this notion that one system trumps the other one becomes a power issue, not an ontological issue. The most important aspect of this convergence is that science is being informed by wisdom. And wisdom is being informed by knowledge. And out of that, I think, come a new set of possibilities for how we can understand reality and, in fact, how we live into it.
Marilyn argues for diversity of worldviews and for harmony among them. But that won't do. If materialism allows other worldviews to coexist as real, it's self-contradictory, suicidal. Materialism dies. Can religion help? Religion and materialism are mortal enemies. But if consciousness requires some kind of soul, as most religions assume and most people believe, then materialism is defeated instantly. I asked the intellectual leader of the intelligent design movement, William Dembski. I'm cautious. Bill, you have pioneered the development of intelligent design as a mathematical, philosophical view to, in essence, defeat the materialistic, naturalistic view of the world. Do you see consciousness as another arrow in your quiver?
I'd like to, but it seems to me that right now we don't have any in-principle proofs that matter cannot generate mind. We'll talk about reductive materialism, non-reductive materialism. And intelligent design actually would not be at odds with a non-reductive materialism. So I don't see consciousness as being an avenue for defeating materialism. I think it's a challenge to materialistic theories. I mean, that, why isn't there a theory? Is it just that it's a very difficult problem on materialist terms, or is it that materialism simply cannot support consciousness?
What I find interesting is that you would look to other things in the physical world as we find it as evidence of design. Some micromotors in certain types of single-cellular animals. Would you see that as being stronger evidence for design than the human consciousness, the self-awareness that we think is the most certain thing that we have?
I think we don't really even fully grasp what consciousness is. I mean, these motors, we can objectify them, we can deal with them, we can quantify. But consciousness, I mean, you read various people, it's an illusion. We don't even really have consciousness. And so what is it? As an argument to defeat materialism, it's not clear that you have a lot really to work with there. And then you've got materialism itself. What is the nature of matter? The sort of reductive materialism, I think we're getting closer there, because this notion that we can get consciousness just by sheer complexity, where basically it's just electrical impulses and just their interaction that gives it to us. But if we're talking a materialism that's non-reductive, that you have some sort of emergent property that has these new causal powers, to me that's mystery mongering there, because you're putting all this emphasis then on emergence. I'm skeptical of all these arguments that other theists think have a lot of weight.
What I'm fascinated by is why the intelligent design of micromotors does move you, whereas consciousness does not.
Well, I think there's a vast difference between things being consistent, and there's sort of this beautiful interplay of things where everything is kind of fitting together hand in glove. I mean, consciousness, non-materialism, belief in God, all of that. But it's one thing for things to fit nicely. Paranoids have delusions that fit nicely,
Sure.
But it's another thing for there to be positive reasons, confirmation, disconfirmation. These sorts of design inferences in biological systems do give me reason, actually, I mean, not just to believe in the design of these systems, but to question the reigning materialistic creation account for biological complexity.
But you do not feel the same way about the nature of consciousness.
No. I think what we'd have to say is we just don't have a materialistic account at this point.
Bill surprised me. I'd have thought he'd eagerly recruit consciousness to defeat materialism and defend his religious worldview. But if consciousness is entirely physical, Bill says, that would not upset his religious convictions. I feel I'm on shifting sands. Scientists, philosophers, even religious believers all seem split over whether consciousness defeats materialism. Why such uncertainty, such confusion? What's going on? I need a philosopher who grasps the uncertainties and confusion troubling consciousness and who values the nature of belief. I meet Eric Schwitzgebel. Eric, does consciousness defeat materialism?
I don't think it defeats materialism. I'm about 50-50 on materialism myself. I started as a materialist, but I also think there are alternative views out there that might also work and that we can't decisively refute.
What caused that transition?
I think it was caused by reflecting on our poor epistemic situation with respect to settling questions of metaphysics. So I think there are basically three ways that you can approach the metaphysics of consciousness. You can do it with science, you can do it with common sense, you can do it with things like theoretical elegance, but none of those things seem to me like they decisively settle among the various options. For me, maybe the last straw was reading Nick Bostrom's simulation argument. The idea that we might be computer programs in an artificial simulated environment. If that's the case, then when I look out at the world, what I'm seeing is something that has been kind of constructed for me by the computer in which we're being instantiated.
But that's a wholly materialistic
No.
Why?
I disagree with that. Does computation have to be material? I don't see why. If something is not spatial, it's not material. Computation doesn't have to be spatial. Space might be a feature of our programming environment that doesn't reflect the fundamental nature of reality. Maybe the fundamental nature of reality is God's mind is a computer transitioning through a Turing table, right? Different kinds of conditional computational possibilities. There's nothing about Turing tables, I think, that has to be spatial.
Okay, I understand your transition away from a hardcore materialist to 50-50 sitting on that fence, along with me, by the way. What's in that other 50%? What are the components of it that make up a non-materialist possible worldview?
There are four broad categories of metaphysical position, right? So one, it would be materialism, but another would be substance dualism, right? The idea that there's an immaterial soul and a material world, and they're equally real and equally fundamental, and one's not reducible to the other. That's a view that deserves some credence, I think.
Certainly, it's been a religious view in many different religions.
I find various forms of idealism also attractive. On an idealist view, what's really fundamental are minds, right? So you could have a view like Berkeley's, where they're just our minds, maybe in interaction with each other and with God, right? Or you could have an atheistic version of that, where they're just our minds in interaction with each other. Another possibility that I find attractive is something like Kantian transcendental idealism.
What is that?
So in transcendental idealism, space is something that's constructed by or created by our minds, right? And not fundamental to reality, kind of independent of us. Or maybe it is, but we don't know that it is. On transcendental idealism, we don't really know what reality fundamentally is like, but there's no particularly good reason to think that it's spatial. It might be something quite alien to us, something that we wouldn't understand, or maybe something mental or something divine. One of the things that, as a skeptic, I want to do is try to put back on the map other possibilities besides materialism that I think philosophers in the 20th century, there's this very quick shift in the philosophical community to materialism.
Scared by science.
Maybe. So I think that swift transition left behind a variety of other views that are worth at least still taking seriously, I think.
For materialism to triumph, it must explain consciousness. Here are 5 ways. 1. Consciousness is an illusion. There's no problem to solve. 2. Neuroscience is making great progress. Eventually, brain will explain mind. 3. Consciousness is a weak, emergent property of the brain, like the wetness of water from hydrogen and oxygen. 4. Consciousness is a strong, emergent property of the brain. Even if consciousness would be impossible to predict, it would still be physical. 5. Consciousness requires a new kind of physical law or force or dimension. I myself reject 1, 2, and 3. Consciousness is not an illusion. Neuroscience can never account for consciousness. Mental states cannot be explained solely in terms of brain states. 4. Strong emergence is a candidate, but how would it work? It must be material, and it can't be magic. If I were a materialist, I'd go for 5. Something beyond known physics. There could be at least 2 non-material explanations of consciousness. 1, a kind of non-physical component that somehow combines with the physical brain. 2, consciousness is the true reality, and the entire material world is either derivative or an illusion. That makes at least 7 possible explanations of consciousness. 5 material, 2 non-material. Which do you think is closer to truth?
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.